Imagine a kingdom so powerful, so sophisticated in its organization and understanding of human behavior that for centuries it eclipsed even Rome in influence, wealth, and stability, yet today its name is almost forgotten, buried beneath the sands of time. What could explain such a paradox, where one of history's most dominant civilizations fades from memory while others, often less complex and less adaptive, dominate our textbooks and popular imagination? The story of this kingdom challenges the way we perceive power, the way human societies manage stress, adapt to uncertainty, and transmit knowledge across generations. It is not merely a tale of conquest or military might. It is a study in collective cognition, the neuroscience of social cohesion, and the psychological architecture that allows some societies to endure while others crumble under the weight of their own ambition. This kingdom, which thrived long before Rome reached its peak, offers us a mirror to examine the hidden mechanisms of resilience and vulnerability in human civilization, and to ask, are we truly masters of our destiny, or are we bound by patterns as ancient and invisible as the neurons firing in our brains? At the heart of understanding this forgotten empire lies the recognition that human societies function as complex adaptive systems, much like the neural networks within our own minds. Just as neurons transmit signals across synapses, creating emergent thought and memory, communities transmit knowledge, norms, and innovations across generations, forming a collective intelligence that can be more powerful than any single ruler's insight. This kingdom, which arose in a region now largely overlooked, had developed a social and administrative network so advanced that it operated almost as a self-regulating system, capable of balancing stress, distributing resources efficiently, and absorbing shocks that would have destroyed lesser states. In modern psychological terms, we might say it had a high degree of cognitive flexibility. Its leaders and citizens were able to perceive, interpret, and respond to changing conditions with an agility that prefigures the adaptive strategies we now study in neuropsychology and behavioral economics. Stressors that would normally provoke panic, famine, invasion, political unrest were instead met with preemptive social strategies, redundancies in infrastructure, and cultural rituals that stabilized collective perception. It is as though the kingdom had discovered empirically the principle that the human brain uses to maintain homeostasis: anticipate, adjust, and recalibrate before collapse becomes inevitable. The kingdom's success was not solely due to military innovation, although its armies were formidable and strategically disciplined. More crucial was the kingdom's approach to human capital, the careful cultivation of skills, the management of collective attention, and the leveraging of psychological insight to maintain cohesion and purpose. Modern neuroscience shows us that perception shapes reality. The way a community interprets events can either catalyze adaptive behavior or trigger destructive panic. In this lost empire, rituals, education, and governance acted as cognitive frameworks, aligning perception with long-term strategy. When confronted with drought, trade disruption, or the threat of invasion, the kingdom's systems mitigated anxiety through ritualized behavior, symbolic acts that reinforced trust, and collective efficacy, and hierarchical yet flexible decision-making that distributed responsibility in a way that mimicked the redundancy found in resilient neural networks. It is as if the society itself was a living brain, each district a neuron, each trade route an axon transmitting essential signals, each cultural norm a neurotransmitter shaping mood, expectation, and action. Yet, the very sophistication that allowed this kingdom to surpass Rome in stability and foresight may have also contributed to its obscurity in historical memory. Power in human societies is often recorded through conquest, monumental architecture, and narrative control, and yet, the empire in question prized subtlety over spectacle. Its capital was a hub of administration, commerce, and intellectual exchange, but it avoided ostentatious displays that might attract envy or destabilize internal cohesion. Its greatest achievements were systemic: the optimization of agriculture, the development of trade networks that connected distant regions with reliability, and the maintenance of a social order capable of absorbing crises without descending into chaos. These are not the kinds of accomplishments that dominate classical histories written by conquerors or chroniclers with agendas. They are the invisible architectures of survival, much like the neural structures in our brains that regulate sleep, attention, and memory without drawing conscious notice, yet without which cognition itself would collapse. Consider the kingdom's approach to information management. In modern terms, it operated a primitive yet remarkably effective cognitive network, encoding knowledge not only in texts or inscriptions, but in social memory, ritual, and practical apprenticeship. Markets were more than spaces of exchange. They were nodes in a dynamic feedback loop that disseminated information, allowed error correction, and reinforced trust between distant communities. Administrative orders were paired with public rituals that encoded social rules into habitual behavior, effectively training the population to respond adaptively to unforeseen circumstances. This is akin to what psychologists call procedural memory, where repeated action patterns allow the brain to navigate complex environments without conscious deliberation. The kingdom understood that human behavior, left unchanneled, is prone to chaos under pressure, and thus created cultural scaffolds that reinforced resilience at scale. Yet even with such extraordinary sophistication, the kingdom was not immune to the caprices of fate. Environmental shifts, trade disruptions, and external pressures eventually tested the limits of its adaptive capacity. Here, the philosophical dimension of its story becomes apparent. The empire's rise and decline remind us that no system, however well designed, exists in isolation. The neuroscience of stress teaches us that prolonged pressure can induce both growth and dysfunction. Societies, like brains, must balance excitation and inhibition. Too little challenge leads to stagnation, too much to collapse. This kingdom, perhaps, experienced an ecological or geopolitical overload, where the accumulated pressures exceeded the capacity of its social networks to compensate. And yet, even in decline, the structures it developed, its knowledge, its trade connections, its cultural norms radiated outward, influencing neighboring regions and seeding the future in ways largely invisible to conventional history. The psychological metaphor extends further when we consider the kingdom's governance. Leaders functioned less as autocrats and more as moderators of collective cognition, guiding perception and attention to optimize group behavior. What if I told you there was an ancient kingdom, a contemporary of Rome, that was in some ways even more advanced? A civilization that vanished from the historical record for centuries, only to be rediscovered with secrets that challenge our understanding of the ancient world. This isn't a fantasy story. This is the real-life tale of the Kingdom of Axum. Most of us have heard of the Roman Empire, a powerhouse of military might, engineering, and law. But while Rome was dominating the Mediterranean, another empire was flourishing in the highlands of what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea. This was Axum, a kingdom that, at its peak, was considered one of the four great powers of the world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. So what made Axum so special? It wasn't just its wealth from trade connecting Africa with the Arabian Peninsula and the Indian Ocean. It was its society. While Rome was built on conquest and the labor of millions of enslaved people, Axum developed a remarkably sophisticated social structure. Let's talk about social cognition. This is the way a society understands itself, how its people relate to each other, and how they perceive their place in the world. It's the invisible software that runs the hardware of a civilization. And Axum's software was running a very different program than Rome's. One of the most stunning examples is Axum's approach to multiculturalism. As a major trading hub, Axum was a melting pot of different cultures, languages, and religions. People from across Africa, the Middle East, and even as far as India lived and worked together. Instead of forcing a single identity, Axumite societies seemed to embrace this diversity. Inscriptions from Axum are found in multiple languages, including Ge'ez, Greek, and Sabaean, reflecting a cosmopolitan society that valued communication and understanding across cultural lines. This stands in stark contrast to the often brutal Roman approach of Romanization, where conquered peoples were expected to adopt Roman culture, language, and religion, often under duress. Then there's the evidence of their religious tolerance. Before its famous conversion to Christianity in the 4th century under King Azana, Axum was a polytheistic society. But even then, there's evidence that different faiths coexisted peacefully. When Christianity arrived, the conversion was not a bloody conflict, but a gradual adoption, with old traditions blending with the new. King Azana himself, in his famous inscriptions, thanks different gods before finally proclaiming his faith in the Christian God. This suggests a nuanced understanding of belief, a recognition that different people have different paths to the divine. This brings us to one of Axum's most groundbreaking achievements in social cognition. It was one of the first empires to officially adopt Christianity as its state religion, around the same time as the Roman Empire under Constantine. But the way it happened was profoundly different. The Axumite conversion story is tied to Frumentius, a Syrian Christian who was shipwrecked on the coast, brought to the royal court, and eventually tutored the young prince, Izana. The adoption of the new faith was based on education, intellectual exchange, and a personal journey of faith by the king, not on military conquest or political decree imposed from above. This shows a society that valued reason and personal conviction. But perhaps the most visible and awe-inspiring evidence of Axum's unique worldview is etched in stone: the giant obelisks, or stelae. These aren't just massive monuments. They are complex symbols of Axumite social structure and belief. The largest of these, the Great Stele, would have stood over 33 meters high, weighing over 500 tons taller and heavier than any single obelisk erected by the Egyptians. It's a marvel of engineering, quarried and transported and erected without the kind of mass slave labor that built many of Rome's monuments. But what do they mean? These stelae are carved to look like multi-story buildings, complete with false doors and windows. They are not tombs in the Egyptian sense, but markers for underground burial chambers. Scholars believe they represent a connection between the earthly realm of the living and the heavenly realm of the ancestors and gods. They are a physical manifestation of the social hierarchy, with the king at the top, mediating between his people and the divine. This tells us something profound about Axumite social cognition. Their society was seen as a multi-layered structure, a great house with many rooms, all connected, from the farmer in the field to the king in his palace, and extending upwards to the spiritual world. It's a vision of an integrated cosmic order where everyone has a place and a purpose. This is a far cry from the Roman concept of citizenship, which was often a transactional relationship based on legal rights and obligations, and which excluded vast swaths of the population, like women and the enslaved, from full participation. So why did Axum fade from history? It wasn't conquered by a rival empire. Its decline was gradual, likely caused by a combination of factors. The rise of Islam in the 7th century shifted trade routes away from the Red Sea, cutting off Axum's primary source of wealth. Climate change may have also played a role, leading to environmental degradation and agricultural decline. The kingdom retreated into the Ethiopian highlands, becoming more isolated. For centuries, its magnificent past became the stuff of legend. It wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries that archaeologists began to uncover the ruins of Axum, piecing together the story of this forgotten superpower. What they found was a civilization that challenges our Eurocentric view of history. Axum shows us that there were other ways to build an empire, other ways to organize a society, and other ways to think about the world. While Rome was focused on external expansion and control, Axum seemed to be focused on internal cohesion and cosmic balance. Their social cognition was built on principles of integration, multiculturalism, and a deep spiritual connection that permeated every aspect of life. They weren't just building an empire of land, they were building an empire of ideas. The story of Axum is a powerful reminder that history is full of hidden chapters and forgotten voices. It forces us to ask, what other advanced civilizations have we overlooked? What other models of society, what other forms of social cognition, are waiting to be rediscovered? The legacy of Axum isn't just in its towering stele or its ancient coins. It is in the idea that there has never been just one way to be advanced, and that the true measure of a civilization might lie not in the territories it conquered, but in the society it created. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more explorations into the forgotten corners of history. Let me know in the comments which lost civilization you'd like to hear about next. See you in the next video.